The lights from the reception hall shimmered against the glass doors as I stood there, clutching a name tag that burned hotter in my hand than any spotlight in that room. The purse, that's what they labeled me. Bold ink pressed onto cheap paper, reducing decades of sacrifice to a single, humiliating punchline. My stomach tightened, and the music behind me suddenly felt miles away, muffled by the rush of blood in my ears. If you've ever been blindsided by someone you love, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Moments like this leave marks no one else can see. I remember walking back to my table, trying to breathe, trying to understand when love had turned into expectation. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I still remember the moment I stepped into that reception hall, expecting to feel joy, maybe even a little pride, watching my granddaughter start a new chapter in her life. Instead, the first thing that greeted me was a name tag waiting at my table. Not my name, not even a mistake, just two sharp little words printed in bold letters. The purse. For a second, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of mix-up, but when I looked around, everyone else had their real names neatly written, pinned to their places like they belonged there. And there I was, reduced to an accessory before I even had a chance to sit down. The room was beautiful in every way. Soft lights, flowers everywhere, the kind of quiet elegance weddings are supposed to have. Yet inside me, everything twisted. I caught the way Lily barely glanced my direction, brushing past me as if my presence was an obligation rather than something meaningful. It was such a small thing, that tag, but the message behind it echoed louder than the music. I felt myself shrink, trying to pretend it didn't sting, trying to keep my face steady while my heart dropped straight through me. As I stood there, surrounded by laughter that suddenly felt miles away, a thought settled heavy on my chest. This wasn't just a careless joke. It wasn't even about the wedding. It was a sign, one I should have noticed a long time ago. Something between us had shifted, and whatever it wasn't small anymore. And that realization stayed with me long after the night was over. I slipped into my seat at the back table, hoping the distance would give me space to breathe. From there, the reception looked almost unreal. Twinkling lights, soft music, the kind of warmth people expect at a wedding. But none of it reached me. I felt like I was watching life happen through a window, close enough to see it clearly, but too far away to touch any of it. As I sat there, the sting of that name tag settled deeper. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the quiet realization that Lily no longer saw me the way I once believed she did. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being her grandmother and had become something more convenient, something transactional. The thought pressed against my chest with a weight I wasn't ready for. I tried to focus on her smile across the room, convincing myself it was enough to see her happy. But even that felt distant, like her joy lived in a place I was no longer invited into. And as the evening carried on without me, an ache began to form, a slow, familiar one I had ignored for years. Sitting there, I finally understood that this moment wasn't isolated. It was a sign of a deeper drift, one that started long before tonight. And that realization pulled me back into memories I had tried so hard to bury. It didn't take much for my mind to slip back into the years when Lily first came to live with me. She was 14 then, still just a child, carrying the kind of grief no one her age should ever have to hold. I remember how she hovered near me in those early days, trying to be strong, but breaking in small, quiet ways when she thought I couldn't see. I made myself a promise back then that I would give her every bit of stability and love I could manage, even if it meant reshaping my entire life. Those years were a constant balancing act. I worked longer hours, picked up extra shifts, and dipped into savings I once thought I'd use for a calm retirement. I enrolled her in a private school because I wanted her to have opportunities her parents had dreamed of for her. That tuition alone was about $68,000 each year. But I never hesitated. Later came college, another massive stretch. But I paid it because I believed in her future. I covered her first apartment so she wouldn't feel pressured to rush into anything unsafe. I bought her first car, helped her through the shaky start of her career, and told myself it was all part of guiding her into adulthood. In the beginning, she was so grateful. I could see it in the way she hugged me a little tighter or left notes on the counter just to say she appreciated me. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that gratitude softened into expectation. Favors became routine, support became assumed, and my sacrifices turned into background noise she no longer noticed. Looking back now, I realize I loved her so fiercely that I may have blurred the line between helping her and sheltering her from the very growth she needed. And that thought lingered in me as I prepared to face the next blow waiting in the present. The wedding bill that would make everything even clearer. I was gathering my things, ready to slip out quietly, when one of the venue staff approached me with an envelope. I remember thinking it might be a thank you card or some small gesture from Lily, something to soften the sting of the evening. But the moment I opened it, the world around me seemed to still. Inside was an invoice, itemized, formal, undeniable. And at the bottom, the total sat there like a punch I never saw coming. More than $45,000 already marked under my name as the expected payer. For a long moment, I just stared at it. There was no conversation about this, no request, no hint that such a burden was coming my way. It was simply assumed, as if my wallet had become part of the wedding plan in the same quiet, unquestioned way that name tag had reduced me to a role instead of a person. The shock settled into something heavier, something quieter. I could feel a shift inside me, the kind that doesn't make noise but changes everything. This wasn't generosity anymore. It wasn't love expressed through support. It was an expectation, deeply rooted, long-growing, and now impossible to ignore. Holding that bill. I realized this pattern had been forming for years, while I kept telling myself it was just a phase. But this moment stripped away every excuse I'd ever made. And as I folded the invoice back into the envelope, a small, steady thought formed. It was time to take a hard look at all the ways I had been giving without boundaries. I sat at my kitchen table long after the wedding. The house quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I opened my laptop, telling myself I just needed to understand the numbers before reacting. But the deeper I went, the more a strange heaviness settled in my chest. Line after line of transactions appeared, payments I had forgotten about, subscriptions tied to Lily's accounts, transfers that had become so routine I barely noticed them anymore. I found automatic withdrawals for her utilities, her phone bill, even small lifestyle expenses that had somehow shifted onto my card. Then came the bigger memories, the private school tuition, the college years that cost $68,000 annually, the apartment I covered for almost 2 years, the car I bought outright, the emergency money I sent during her job transition. Each piece looked manageable on its own, but seeing them together was like watching a puzzle assemble itself into a picture I didn't want to face. When I finally added the totals, the numbers staring back at me didn't feel real. It wasn't just money, it was time, security, and boundary after boundary stretched thin until it vanished. And for the first time, I let myself feel the weight of it, not as guilt for giving, but as grief for how much of myself I had quietly handed away. I sat there, breathing deeply, letting the truth settle. This wasn't generosity anymore. It had become a pattern, one I had unknowingly built and Lily had learned to expect. And just as that realization sank in, another one followed, a quiet nudge that something about Justin's financial behavior had never added up. It was time to look closer, even if I didn't want to see what was coming. I stopped by Lily and Ryan's apartment that afternoon with the simplest intention. Lily had asked me to water the plants while they were away, and I told myself it would be good to feel useful in a harmless way. The place was quiet when I stepped inside. Sunlight stretching across the living room, everything looking perfectly ordinary. For a moment, I let myself imagine that things really were as peaceful as they seemed. I set my purse down on the counter, and that's when I noticed Ryan's phone buzzing. I wouldn't have touched it under normal circumstances, but the screen lit up with a message preview in plain sight. The words were impossible to ignore. References to overdue payments, threats disguised as reminders, hints of desperation. I felt a cold ripple move through me, the kind that stops your breath for a second. I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, but more messages kept coming. Numbers, escalating amounts, mentions of high-interest loans. Then the phrase that made my stomach drop. The $200,000 he owed. 200,000. I felt the room tilt slightly, as if the truth had weight and it had just landed on me. What struck me hardest wasn't just the debt. It was the way the messages spoke about Lily, as if she were a resource he needed to secure. And worse, references to me, his expectation that I would cover whatever Lily couldn't. The realization sank in slowly but brutally. He hadn't just fallen into trouble. He had built a plan around her, around us, counting on the very patterns I had allowed for years. I stood there in the silence of their apartment, holding onto the counter to steady myself. A fierce, protective instinct rose up inside me, stronger than the shock, sharper than the fear. I didn't know how much Lily understood about the man she had married, but I knew I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I left the apartment that day with a single, steady thought. I needed to uncover the full truth before this swallowed her whole. The day after I saw those messages, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't ease. Fear and disbelief kept circling each other in my mind, but beneath them was something steadier, a quiet resolve I hadn't felt in years. I reached out to an old attorney friend, someone I trusted enough to speak honestly with. I didn't share every detail, but I described enough for him to guide me toward what I needed to look for. His calm, measured responses grounded me, even as my heart pressed against my ribs. I spent the afternoon reviewing documents, piecing together anything that might help me understand how deep Ryan's instability went. Bank statements, credit pulls, odd withdrawals, they all painted a picture I wasn't prepared to see. What broke me most was realizing Lily had unknowingly covered some of his debts already. Small amounts here and there, disguised as shared expenses, but unmistakable once I saw the pattern. She had been drawn in without even noticing the shift. A wave of heartbreak washed over me, not just for the danger she was walking toward, but for the innocence she still carried. Believing love would straighten out the flaws in someone who wasn't willing to change. But alongside that heartbreak came clarity. I had spent years cushioning her from consequences, And now those habits were being used against her. I couldn't let this continue. By evening, I had gathered everything I needed: evidence, notes, and the beginnings of a plan. My hands trembled, but my decision did not. The next step was inevitable. I had to close every financial door Ryan was counting on. When I finally shut off the last automatic payment, there was a silence in my house that felt heavier than any noise. I knew what it meant. I knew what would follow. But there was no other choice left. Not if I wanted to protect Lily, and not if I wanted to reclaim the parts of myself I had given away without even realizing it. The first signs came quickly: a decline charge, then two, then a string of small failures that must have hit her all at once. By late afternoon, my phone lit up with her messages. Confusion at first, then frustration, then something closer to panic. I could almost hear her voice trembling beneath each word, trying to understand how her world had shifted so suddenly. I called her back because I wasn't going to hide. I told her, as gently as I could, that I had stepped back from supporting her financially. I expected anger, maybe disbelief. What I didn't expect was the stunned silence that followed, an emptiness so loud I felt it through the phone. And then I told her the part she didn't see coming. I told her I knew about the gambling debt, the $200,000 hanging over Ryan's head, the way he had woven both of us into his plans without our consent. Hearing her breathe in sharply, hearing her try to piece together what that meant, it broke something in me. Not out of regret for my decision, but out of sorrow for how deep she had fallen without realizing it. In that moment, she saw the truth of her dependence, the fragility of her marriage, and the danger she was standing in. And as her voice finally cracked, I felt a new tension rising, something restless and unpredictable, because Ryan had just lost the lifeline he was counting on. When the money stopped, I expected tension, maybe arguments, maybe a scramble. What I didn't expect was how fast Ryan began to fall apart. It was as if the ground beneath him had already been cracking, and the moment the support vanished, everything split open. I didn't witness it directly, but the signs flooded in from every direction. Missed calls from numbers Lily didn't recognize, messages that came through at strange hours, the sound of Ryan pacing in the background whenever Lily called me in fear. There was a frantic edge to everything, a wildness that told me he was cornered. I could feel his desperation leaking into our lives, even from a distance. Lily tried to hide how shaken she was, but I could hear it in the way her breath quivered when she spoke. She finally understood that his debt wasn't just a mistake, it was a trap, and he had dragged both of us close to the edge of it. Part of me pitied him, knowing the weight of $200,000 pressing down on him. But another part saw the truth clearly. This was the cost of his choices he had made long before Lily ever loved him. I reminded myself of that each time fear crept into my chest. I started preparing quietly, locking doors, keeping my phone close, letting the house settle into a kind of watchful stillness. I could feel something gathering, something heavy and unavoidable. Every instinct in me tightened with the same quiet warning. Because the moment a man like Ryan loses control of his access to money, he looks for someone to blame. And I knew he was coming to my door next. Lily reached her breaking point on a quiet morning. The kind of morning that should have felt ordinary. Instead, she told me later that she woke with a hollow feeling, realizing Ryan had vanished again, leaving behind only the echo of his chaos. She stood alone in that apartment, surrounded by bills, empty promises, and the weight of a marriage that had slowly strangled her hopes. I could almost feel her cracking open as she understood she could no longer stay there. Not if she wanted to survive in any sense that mattered. When she reached out to me, her voice carried a tremble I had not heard since she was a teenager. It was full of fear and confusion, but underneath all of that, I heard something else. Something small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. It was the first sound of awakening, the moment a person realizes they have to choose themselves before they disappear completely. When she arrived at my house, she looked shattered, but she also carried the faintest glimmer of resolve. I held her for a long time, feeling the years of dependence, denial, and misplaced loyalty peeling away as she cried against my shoulder. I knew then that this was her turning point, the place where endings become beginnings. Letting her move in wasn't just an act of sheltering, it was a reset. I told her gently that things would be different now, that she would learn to stand on her own feet, and that I would walk beside her, but not carry her. As she settled into the guest room, I felt the house shift into a new rhythm, one shaped by healing and responsibility. It was a hopeful, uncertain start, but it was hers, and it was time to begin again. Those first weeks with Lily were some of the hardest I have ever witnessed. When the immediate shock of leaving Ryan faded, it was as if the weight of her entire life collapsed onto her shoulders at once. I would hear her crying behind the closed door of the guest room. Those long, aching sobs that come from a place deeper than words. Shame, grief, and confusion poured out of her in waves, and all I could do was let her break without rushing to pick up the pieces for her. I had done too much of that already. In those quiet hours, I found myself reflecting on how easily love can turn into enabling. I had believed I was protecting her, but in truth, I had been softening every blow life tried to teach her. Now, tough love meant stepping back, even when my heart wanted to step in. Little by little, I watched her rise. She started simple, learning to budget her small income, scribbling numbers on a notepad even when they scared her. She burned her first attempts at cooking, laughed through tears at the mess, and tried again the next night. She showed up to work every day, even when fatigue tugged at her. And slowly, I saw glimpses of the girl she once was, steady, hopeful, willing. Her victories were small, but each one mattered. I felt pride blooming in me, not the pride of a rescuer, but the pride of someone finally watching her stand. By the end of the month, her steps had more purpose. She began asking questions about long-term plans, about rebuilding, about responsibility. And I knew we were ready for the next chapter. A chapter where she would begin making things right, not just with the world, but with herself. When Lily finally told me the truth, it happened in one of those quiet evenings when the house felt softer than usual. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly, and I could feel something heavy gathering in the air. I waited, letting her find her own way to whatever needed to be said. When the words came, they landed like a weight on my chest. She told me the name tag at the wedding, the one that called me the purse, had not been a careless joke or a thoughtless mistake. It had been planned. Ryan's idea? A test, she said. A twisted way for him to see how much I would tolerate, how easily I could be manipulated, how tightly he could pull the strings of my love for her. And she admitted she went along with it, not out of malice, but out of fear and the fog of someone who had been misled for far too long. For a moment, I felt the familiar sting of humiliation all over again, sharper now that I knew it was deliberate. Betrayal has a way of echoing through old wounds, and this one echoed deep. But as Lily's voice wavered, as her eyes filled with regret rather than excuses, something inside me shifted. I saw the young woman she used to be, the one trying to claw her way back to herself. I let the pain settle, and then I let it loosen its grip. Her honesty mattered. Her accountability mattered even more. In that moment, trust didn't snap back into place. It began, slowly, carefully, to rebuild. And as we sat there in the soft kitchen light, I knew the next step wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what kind of future I could help her secure, and what healing would look like from here. When the truth finally settled between us, I felt something inside me steady for the first time in a long while. I spent a quiet morning at the dining table, looking over the years behind us and the years still ahead. And I realized I needed to give Lily something she had never truly been offered. A chance to stand on her own feet. Not through punishment, but through structure. Through trust. Through responsibility. So I built a repayment plan. Simple enough to follow, but firm enough to matter. It wasn't about getting the money back. It was about teaching her that her life could hold shape and discipline. That she could build something real with her own hands. And before I handed it to her, I told her the secret I had carried for years. I had always planned to help her financially, far more than she ever knew. I had saved and prepared and tucked money aside, imagining a moment when she would be ready to use it with wisdom rather than panic. But I could not give it while she was still drifting, still letting others steer her life. Saying it out loud was harder than I expected. I felt the weight of every choice I had made, every time I rescued too quickly, every time I mistook love for fixing. I told her I refused to repeat the patterns that had shaped me, the ones that taught me to bear everything in silence. When Lily looked at the plan, I saw humility instead of entitlement, hope instead of expectation, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't just accepting a plan. She was accepting herself, finally, as someone capable of rebuilding. As we stood together in that quiet room, I felt the first true breath of our future, steady, honest, and ready for the final chapter that waited ahead. When I look back on everything that has happened, it feels like watching myself walk through a long, dim hallway and finally stepping into the light. That moment at the wedding, the sting of that name tag, the unraveling that followed, it all pushed me toward a truth I had avoided for years. I had given so much of myself that I forgot I was allowed to have boundaries, allowed to choose peace, allowed to be more than what others expected of me. And somehow, through all the heartbreak, I found my way back to myself. I learned that love without boundaries becomes burden, and generosity without intention becomes a trap. Reclaiming my dignity was not a single choice, but 1,000 small ones, each one reminding me that my worth did not come from what I paid for, rescued, or carried. Watching Lily grow has been its own quiet blessing. She is not healed, not finished, not perfect, but she is trying. She is learning to stand, to choose, to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, I feel hope for both of us. Not the desperate kind that begs for change, but the steady kind that comes when change has already begun. If any part of my story touches something inside you, I hope you let it sit for a moment. Think about your own boundaries, your own worth, your own healing. And if you feel comfortable, share your experiences in the comments. You never know who might need to hear your story too.